Welcome back to Free Space News. So today I have a slightly different story than the previous one. Today I'm going to be talking about a new report from, I believe this is The Intercept, yes, The Intercept, that talks about how despite Trump saying that the U.S. is going to pull out of Syria, that bombing has actually increased in Syria since that happened. So The Intercept says, quote, "During the final days of 2018, the U.S. campaign bombed villages up and down the Euphrates, focusing primarily on Al-Kashma. On the night of New Year's Eve, the bombs relentlessly assaulted Al-Kashma, leaving the villages largely destroyed by the next morning, according to an ISIS fighter who was there. The coalition against ISIS appears to be targeting internet cafes, according to two sources on the ground. Internet cafes in the villages are used by civilians and ISIS fighters alike. They are not part of ISIS's tactical communications infrastructure, according to sources, but the militants typically use them to communicate with the outside world, especially their families in other countries," end quote. So the point about how the bombings were targeting internet cafes is really, really important because, like it says, internet cafes are more or less, they're a place where ISIS meets, but they're also places where just regular civilians meet, which is what you would think an internet cafe is for. So the article talks a little bit more about why that's a bit of an issue. Later on in the article it says, quote, "On Sunday, the U.S. military admitted that it's killed 1,139 civilians in Iraq and Syria since the start of its campaign against ISIS in 2014. That number is significantly smaller than the estimates of civilian casualties put out by monitoring groups like Airways, which says that the U.S. has killed between 7,308 and 11,629 civilians. So when you bomb places that have such a high number of civilians, you're obviously going to kill a lot of civilians." Emily Mana of the Georgetown Public Policy Review has some great insight about why exactly it's a problem to kill civilians, especially in the Middle East. So she says in her new analysis published at the Georgetown Public Policy Review, "In fact, looking at the incidences of terrorism in parts of Pakistan hit with U.S. drone strikes from 2006 to 2012, Mana discovered that the terrorist activity actually increased in provinces after they were subjected to drone warfare." So this kind of makes sense, right? So if you have some sort of terrorist target that you're going after, and you bomb an internet cafe or some other civilian meeting place, well, then you're going to probably kill way more civilians than you are going to kill actual terrorists. And if you kill a lot of civilians, or really if you kill any civilians, that's going to create resentment from people who knew those civilians, and they are much more likely to be radicalized by groups like ISIS who are trying to recruit more and more fighters in the Middle East. So it's clear when you look at the data that bombing these kinds of civilian meeting places, it's not exactly the best strategy to go with. Now, I think this story is really interesting, not just from the perspective of this specific bombing and how it relates to civilian casualties, but I also think that it's interesting as how it relates to the whole Trump-Russia scandal. So, if you're not really familiar with the geopolitics of alliances in the Middle East with greater actors like the U.S. and Russia, President Assad and the Syrian government are basically backed by Vladimir Putin. They're considered allies in the Middle East. So given that, bombing the ally of Vladimir Putin isn't exactly the thing that you should do if you're Putin's puppet or an agent of the Kremlin or whatever. Now, this bombing specifically that the Intercept was reporting on wasn't against Assad; it was against ISIS and other rebels in Syria. But the thing is, the United States has been bombing on both sides of the war for years. So if we continue to stay in Syria and bomb ISIS, it's much more likely that we're going to continue to bomb the Syrian government as well, as long as we stay there. So my basic take on Trump-Russia is that I think it's pretty clear, and there's a lot of evidence that Trump did money laundering with not only the Russian government, but the Turkish and Israeli governments as well. I think it's pretty clear Trump wants to fire Robert Mueller since he's been appointed to be a special counsel to investigate Donald Trump, and he's only been finding more and more dirt on him and his cabinet members. And I think Trump's really worried that Mueller could find some sort of impeachable financial crimes. And if Trump were to fire Robert Mueller, that would absolutely be obstruction of justice. But despite that there is something to this issue, I also think that there's been a lot of hyper-focus on it. And I think the reason for that is that on several key policy issues, Trump has actually gone against Russia and Vladimir Putin's interests. Now I could do a whole video on what exactly those policies are, but today I just want to focus on the Syria one since that's what this story is about. So according to the BBC in 2018, the US, the UK, and France... So according to the BBC in August of 2018, the US, the UK, and France have bombed 3 government sites in Syria in an early morning operation targeting chemical weapons facilities, they say. The move is a response to a suspected chemical attack on the town of Doma last week, which killed dozens. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he condemned the Western strikes in the most serious way. Russia, Syria's main ally, has threatened military retaliation if any Russian forces had been hit. Now luckily, Putin has not retaliated against the West in any way, and those threats seem to be not exactly, and he hasn't exactly followed on any of those threats. But regardless, it's a little scary when the Russian president says he's going to do something to retaliate against the West if his forces are hit in Syria, which is where his ally Assad and his government are. So then flash forward to a month ago, and Trump and the administration announced that we're leaving Syria, we're pulling our troops out. A lot of liberals seem to freak out after that. Now they say it's further evidence that Trump is Putin's puppet and that he's working for the Kremlin. Now my response to that is that regardless of why Trump is pulling out of Syria, this is something that liberals should absolutely support. It's an anti-war position. Pulling out of Syria, regardless of why he's doing it, means that there are going to be fewer civilians killed in the Middle East, there are going to be fewer terrorists formed as a result of it. We can stop fighting an unwinnable war, and we won't further escalate with probably our biggest adversary in the world, which is Russia. But flash forward to today, or just a few days ago when this story came out, and it seems like the few hawks remaining in Trump's administration have convinced him that pulling out of Syria is a really bad idea, and it's not really clear when we're actually going to be leaving Syria, or even if we're going to be leaving Syria. So that's going to do it for today's video. Had some issues with people being able to subscribe at first. Now you absolutely can subscribe. The subscribe button's working, so make sure to like this video, subscribe, share it with friends, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya!